Let's return to our example. We already have our activity started. Now we want the relevant layout to be displayed. In the example from the slide, we see that there is a text field to enter the task contents, a checkbox which makes it possible to check whether the task was completed the moment it was added, and a button which starts the action. In this case, we use a relative layout to illustrate how such a layout behaves and how to use it to create more advanced views. It's important to emphasize that such a layout could also be carried out using a linear layout. We return to the XML file and remove the unnecessary text fields. Now we place the three components here. We want the edit text to take up as much width and height as it needs, but no more. The same goes for the checkbox. The final element is a button with the same size properties. We can notice right away that all the elements overlap. This is because the relative layout, as its name suggests, operates on the relative location of objects in relation to each other. Having a number of views, we must specify how they are placed in relation to one another. Additionally, a relative layout allows us to place elements on top of one another. Here we have the concept of the Z-layer, which allows elements to be put on top of one another. Thanks to this, the elements which are higher in the XML file are displayed at the very bottom, and subsequent elements cover them. In order to be able to use the relative layout, we need ID files. This is because we have to specify the dependencies between objects. Having three elements with assigned IDs, we can start defining the dependencies between them. In the simplest case, we can say that the checkbox is below the edit text. We obtain this with the Layout Below option. We can do the same for the button. We gain access to the right distribution of elements the same way. In the case of such an application, the linear layout is a better choice because the elements are placed one under the other. We don't need to define the dependencies between them. We just place them in the right order. However, in our case, we just want to illustrate the operation of the relative layout. If we want our view to land at the very bottom of the layout, we can define the Layout Align Parent Bottom option. It's a flag where we define whether the element should be glued to the bottom. As we have two limitations informing, on the one hand, that the layout has to be below the checkbox, and on the other hand, that the button has to be glued to the bottom, both conditions try to be fulfilled automatically. So the button gets stretched. Having removed the relationship to the checkbox, the button is placed at the bottom. We can operate similarly when gluing elements to the left and right edge. We can also define the location in relation to elements. For instance, we may define that our checkbox doesn't take up the full display width, but only what it needs. Next to it, we could place a text view, but we take advantage of the fact that it is actually a text view with an additional icon and the possibility of selecting. This way, we get a field for selecting with a label which is not glued to it. By using wrap content, we see that the field width is as big as necessary to select the icon and the text to be displayed. With this, we have the possibility of placing this button element on the right-hand side. The button that had been at the bottom can be aligned to the right part of the checkbox. Using Layout Align Right would cause the right sides of both elements to be aligned. If we wanted the element to be on the right, we'd have to use Layout to Right of. A relative layout is a pretty complex layout which makes it possible to obtain complex views. However, this takes place at the expense of the computing power which is needed to prepare a layout. We do not recommend to use the relative layout as a sublayout, because this requires additional calculations when preparing each layout. A relative layout is very useful at the highest level, unless we want to build extremely complex hierarchies. Now we restore our layout to the previous version, which fulfills our assumptions. Our text field requires a prompt too. The button also needs some content. We can also add certain margins or paddings. A padding is an internal margin, that is a space between the contents of a button or element and its frame. In our case, we can specify that the button needs a padding of 30 dp. As a result, 30 dp will be added at each side of the text. Apart from paddings, we can also use margins. This works the same as in the case of the linear layout. Relative layouts make it possible to set elements in relation to one another, whereas margins make it possible to add spaces between particular elements.